Hello, I'm Nancy Merrill, President of the Colorado Crane Conservation Coalition. Today we are visiting a landmark of the Yampa Valley, the historic Carpenter Ranch, owned and operated by the Nature Conservancy. Every year for the annual Yampa Valley Crane Festival, we hold a number of events here at the Carpenter Ranch, such as guided bird viewing, guided crane viewing, and a community picnic. I'm here today with Betsy Blakeslee, longtime manager of the Carpenter Ranch, and she will be leading us today on our tour of this historic property. Betsy and her husband Jeff have managed the ranch for over 20 years, and just this past year have handed the management reins onto a new couple, Sally and Matt Ross. So Betsy will tell us a little bit about the history of the ranch, about the history of the Carpenter family, and also why this beautiful property is such an attractive area for our Yampa Valley Sandhill Cranes. Betsy?
Thanks, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here to give this history tour. There's so much to tell about. I'm going to start with the barn behind us because that is the iconic barn that when I first came down the driveway of the Carpenter Ranch to take this job 23 years ago. This barn has been described as a mother hen with her chicks alongside of her, and you can see what that looks like. It was built in 1902 and 3 when John Dawson came up from his ranch in New Mexico on the Bermejo River and brought his family to this place to start a ranch for mules. He had a cattle ranch in New Mexico, but his new endeavor was to be raising mules here. And he contracted with Abram Fisk, who was the homesteader that lived here since the late 1880s. And Fisk had a sawmill. He asked Fisk to please build him a barn and to build a house on the property that could house his enormous family. So this barn was built out of cottonwood, which is the tree du jour in the forest here. In those times, you could do that. It was built to house 8 teams of mules, and on the upper story, it housed all the hay that they would ever need to feed the mules. And the loft is, it's unique in that the stalls are sitting below the openings in the loft where they would just pitch hay down, but also they could pitch hay out of the big window in the front. The loft would had a pulley system that dropped into a hay wagon that would go out to the fields and feed. So those times were different. We didn't have tractors like this John Deere sitting here, but they made things work really well. And this barn has persevered for over 100 years and is still the iconic structure that we see when we come down the driveway of the Carpenter Ranch. Behind me, you can see the Carpenter Ranch Historic Building. It's on the Register of Historic Places, both in our county, our state, and on the National Register. It was placed on the National Register when the Nature Conservancy bought the ranch in 1996. When Abram Fisk sold the ranch to Dawson in 1902, this structure wasn't what it looks like today. It was one homestead. And what you see is a result of Mr. Dawson contracting the Fisk family to build a new house, but it was the pieces were dragged by mules on logs from surrounding homesteads. So this is actually 5 homesteads put together, kind of like Lincoln logs. And they were in pieces, so you can see behind me how that nook and cranny architectural style comes out. And the house is, when we get inside, you'll see the nooks and crannies, but I wanted you to see how, what a rare architectural feat it was to move 4 of these homesteads together from the surrounding 160-acre parcels that they originally stood on. When we go inside, we'll get a little more history of that time period and who lived here. You may notice this crane flying over my head. Lots of people ask, well, what is that crane doing in your education center? We had a unique opportunity to pick up this crane from where he had an accident across the highway and flew into some electric lines. So the Division of Wildlife gave us permission to take the crane and use the crane as an educational display in our facility. We're now standing in one of the original homesteads that was pieced together in this house. The kitchen for the entire house was in this room, but in 1974 there was a kitchen fire and it burned. Because then this room was not historic after we rebuilt it, or the Carpenter family rebuilt it, we were able to, when the Nature Conservancy bought this, we were able to use historic funds to make this an education center and a room where people could meet. So this is our education facility and meeting center. People come here for all kinds of reasons, and one of them is for scientific research, because the Nature Conservancy is a science-based organization. We do important research on mammals and insects and cattle and all kinds of information and population estimates, how these species use the land, how they're going to use the land in the future. So research is real important. People come because it's on the historic register. They want to know the legacy of Ferry Carpenter. They want to know about agriculture and history. People want to know about our conservation work. Our mission is to see how agriculture and conservation can go hand in hand. So it's a really exciting place to come because that's always being developed and discovered. One of the biggest uses of this property is for birders, and particularly during the Crane Festival, I'm always happy to give a tour because the people who come here to bird and specifically to view cranes are so interested and so much appreciate the Nature Conservancy's efforts to protect this riparian forest that exists here and to make sure that bird habitat stays protected and welcoming for all the species that nest or migrate through the forest. In May of 2001, we invited artists from 3 surrounding high schools to choose some students to spend the weekend here, and with the intention of creating a mural. This project was called Scientists Collect Data and Artists Collect Images. So we send these students out on the riverbank on a Friday evening to document everything that they saw. They were collecting data, but in the form of images. And for the next 2 days, they spent collaborating on this mural to really tell the story of this meandering Yampa River and all of the creatures and critters that you would see on a Friday night in May. And one of the most interesting, I think, is the bobolink, who is eating a seed head of a dandelion. And from then on, I would look for the dandelions to go to seed, and I would expect the bobolinks to be coming in, because they fly from the point of Argentina all the way up, land in the hay meadows here, have their babies, and fly back to Argentina. Huge long flight. And those seeds, when they come up, are their sustenance for the summer that they're here, the time that they're here. There's also a story behind every image that you see there, and the students learned about how important it is to have a wild and free running river, that creates, the flood regime creates the way that the river meanders through these fields. We don't have a lot of elevation here, but we do need the water, so the water is fairly flat and easy to divert, and water crops throughout Morgan Bottom area, which is in this West Route County area. Artists have been coming here forever that we can document, and I think it's a wonderful way to be inspired by nature, to express what you appreciate about this area. When the Nature Conservancy gutted this room and restored it, they decided to make it into an education center with displays that would speak to the values and the goals of the Nature Conservancy's program here. They set up 3 panels, one on my right to talk about the culture of this valley before the Dawson Carpenter families and the Nature Conservancy, and highlight the Native Americans. The Native Americans were said to be in this area of the Yampa Basin for 6,000 years before the time that the fur trappers opened up this area, and then the homesteaders came after the Homesteaders Act was passed in 1862. So we speak to how this river and these fields and the snow melt all contribute to a desirable place to be, whether you're hunter-gatherers or you're fur trappers or you are ranchers or farmers. The middle display talks about who Ferry Carpenter was and highlights his bull sale. There are pictures that are historic images from his bull sale. His bull sales. In the fall of every year, he sold registered Herefords, and people came from all over the country to buy from him. He was one of the biggest livestock producers in the nation. And then to my left is our displays that speak more to the flood regime and how sediment that's deposited after the floods creates habitat for this forest, which is a globally rare forest. And that means that these 3 species that are highlighted here, the red osier dogwood, the box elder, and the narrowleaf cottonwood, growing together make up a forest community and are found nowhere else on the planet but within about 60 miles of here. And this community forest is home to over 150 species of nesting and migrating birds. And so a huge focus here is to maintain that forest, to understand how we can best do that and what are the best practices that are going to keep this landscape, this natural landscape, intact. We've crossed the threshold from the renovated education center into the main part of the house that is actually museum-like. It's a legacy to Ferry Carpenter and his way of life. On the walls, you'll see photos and maps that speak to the way of life during the time that both the Dawsons and the Carpenters were here. There's a homesteader's map. There's a photo of a schoolhouse. There is a photo of the ranch when the river went right by the ranch house here. It no longer does that. And so these photos are so important to have because they tell the story of the river and how it migrates. And it's really nice to show people in actual visual images what life was like then and how it compares to now. The rest of the dining room is full of some unique pieces, some antiques, and all of it reflects how Ferry Carpenter lived, which was different and special because most ranchers didn't have this antique furniture and didn't use white linens at the table and didn't have this glassware in their hutches. The family generously donated all of this memorabilia to the Nature Conservancy when the Nature Conservancy bought the ranch in 1996. This is a stunning piece that holds the silver and initial silvered and some unique pieces. So you can see that Ferry led a different life. The pictures on the wall, in contrast, are of loose hay being stacked, of vehicles in the 40s, and takes you back to the time when he lived here. Welcome to Ferry Carpenter's living room. Ferry had such an interesting career. He was famous for his livestock business, but before he really settled into his livestock business, he did a multitude of other jobs. So he was the first attorney in Hayden. He was the first tax collector in Colorado. He is most famous for his work on the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, where he implemented a law that required grazing districts to be created throughout the West. These districts first had to be mapped and surveyed because it was all open, millions of acres of open land that hadn't been settled. And then he got ranchers and farmers together to jointly describe how these grazing districts should be appropriated and the laws of the land be adhered to. And one of the focuses of that grazing law was to make sure that, first of all, cattle and sheep people stayed separate because they hadn't gotten along for so long, and also that the open lands were not overgrazed. So the 30s were a big time for Ferry, and he became the first director of grazing for the Department of Interior in Washington, which later turned into the Bureau of Land Management in the 40s. This chair I'm sitting in was given to Ferry when he retired from the Bureau of Land Management in appreciation for his work. Ferry would host artists and writers and anybody who would listen to a story. This chair was a place where Ferry would sit and entertain his bull buyers and anybody who walked through the door with his stories. He was a storyteller. In the early 30s, Isla McAfee came west to document Western landscapes, and he hosted her here on the ranch for a while. She painted his favorite, not family members, but bulls, Onward Pioneer, and behind me is Sir Blanchard. Most people have their portraits. on the walls, but these are the portraits of his favorite and valuable bulls. In this room, Ferry had a coal-fired blaze going in the fireplace 24 hours, or probably every day of the year, 24 hours a day, because that's how this house was heated. The upstairs was freezing, and his heirs, the children, talk about running from bed to this fireplace here because that was to keep them from freezing to death upstairs while they slept. There are so many artifacts in this room. There's a Rosa Bonheur print above the fireplace, and there's we're not sure if this is from Sir Blanchard or Onward Pioneer, but there is a rug, a hide on the floor that is a Hereford rug and has been here for as long as anybody can remember. We're about to enter Ferrys Library, and the family of Ferry Carpenter graciously gave this library on a long-term loan to the Nature Conservancy. It is filled with books that Ferry read throughout his life. It is filled with all of the memorabilia that surrounded his livestock business. There are awards, there are certificates of appreciation, and all of it tells a story about Ferry's involvement in the cattle industry. This room is full of all the information, not all, but a lot of the information that was the basis and foundation of Ferry's intellectual life. Ferry attended Princeton undergrad for 4 years and graduated in 1909, and then Harvard Law School after that for 4 years and graduated in 1912. In the meantime, in the summers, he was coming out to Routt County, where he had filed on a homestead at Oak Point, which is several miles north of here. While he was in school at Princeton, he wrote to his father and said, "I'm going to sell my books, and so I can have some money to buy some new books for the next semester." And his father wrote back and said, "Never sell your books. Keep your books, I'll pay for new books." So now we have an indication of Ferry's interests and the type of work he was focused on while he was in school and afterwards. The bookshelves are lined with plaques that indicate different categories of books, like legal, livestock, classics, poetry, Western novels, religion. And it's amazing to look at these books and understand when you know that for instance, Abraham Lincoln was a mentor for him, and he has a Lincoln Library where he gained all the respect and admiration for him. I also, in this room, is Ferry's desk that he sat at when he was an attorney in Hayden, the first attorney in Hayden. And that office is still standing in Hayden on Walnut Street. It's a very narrow room that was also used as a bowling alley. And this desk was in the back of the room. It was kind of a unique office for an attorney. One of the, I think, pivotal points in his life at Princeton was his relationship with Woodrow Wilson. And he has a portrait of Woodrow Wilson in the corner here. Scattered throughout this room are evidence of his societies and organizations that he participated in. And one of the most important is Performance Registry International, which was an organization where he and his colleagues were responsible for creating a whole new perspective on how cattle were judged. Ferry wrote a book called Confessions of a Maverick. He was known as a maverick. He said, I never had a job that I wasn't fired from. And his participation in Performance Registry International was a really good example of how he was a maverick. So instead of judging cattle on their show ring appearance, he felt that cattle should be judged on their abilities to contribute different genetic capabilities to herds in our whole country. So Performance International was focused on that, of documenting records of cattle that indicated their birth weight, their weaning weight, what kind of mothers they were, their fertility, and it changed the industry, and he is renowned for that change. It wasn't appreciated during the time, but it grew into a way of doing business in the livestock business that all livestock organizations use today. In 1980, Farrington Reed Carpenter was honored by his induction to the Hereford Heritage Hall. It was probably his most proud moment. He had always wanted to be accepted by the Hereford Association, but being a maverick, it always kind of stood in the way. Soon after he was inducted, he died in December of 1980. In that book, all of the pictures in the hallway where I'm standing are documented. Confessions of a Maverick is the story of his life, his contributions to the livestock industry, his contributions to the state of Colorado, our national government in the form of Director of Grazing for the Department of Interior, and his upstanding citizenship while he was alive.
Betsy, thank you so much for that fabulous tour of the historic building here on the Carpenter Ranch. We are so honored to be an event that you sponsor for the Yampa Valley Crane Festival year after year. We hope people will come out in person in the near future to take this tour in the flesh.
That would be great. And the Nature Conservancy is honored to partner with the Colorado Crane Conservation Coalition, and we are committed to protecting this natural landscape for cranes in the future and people in the future.